Get to record.
Very excited in that to have Anna Fialkoff of the Wild Seed Project with us today. She's going to talk about ecological gardening. In terms of Anna's own interests and background, she is currently a program manager with the Wild Seed Project, and she's mostly engaged, or she's engaged a lot in educational programming with partner organizations, as well as as a catalyst for a movement to rewild Maine. And maybe we'll hear a little bit about that. Most recently, she was a senior horticulturist at the Native Plant Trust and Garden that we know about, Garden in the Woods, in Framingham, where she designed and installed native plant gardens. Again, we're all very interested in that as well, and maybe we'll hear more from that. She's got she's got a wealth of experience and knowledge that we, at least I personally can't wait to hear of. So Anna, I'm turning it over to you. Now, Lisa, you're going to
Okay, shall I share my screen now?
Yep.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Anna Fialkoff. Thank you so much, Shubhra, for the introduction. And I'm really excited to be able to chat with you all this lunchtime, chilly August morning, about ecological gardening and my passion for that. I want to share with you, some of you who may not know very much about Wild Seed Project and what we do. And welcome to those who came also from the Wild Seed Project website or our newsletter, who are not necessarily members of the Rockport Garden Club. You're all welcome, and I'm happy that you joined today too. So Wild Seed Project is a nonprofit, and we're based out of Portland, Maine. Our mission is really to increase the awareness about native plants and all they have to offer, and get people motivated to plant native in their own backyards, neighborhoods, and communities in order to restore habitat for wildlife. So that's all about what Wild Seed Project does. We also sell seeds of native plants and on our website through our online store, and we come out with a publication annually. This year, our publication was a native tree guide. So I will share a little bit about that with you during the presentation and other aspects of what we do at Wild Seed Project. Most recently, Wild Seed Project has launched an initiative called the Pledge to Rewild, which is really about, rewilding is really about restoring native plants to local habitats, adopting mindful landscape practices, because it's not just what you plant, but how you manage your plantings that can increase wildlife value in your yards, and joining forces with others to spread that message that we need to plant native when possible. So we've gotten a lot of our inspiration and knowledge for this movement from somebody named Douglas Tallamy. And many of you have probably seen his talks, because Shubhra mentioned to me that he's spoken for the Rockport Garden Club, which is awesome. Many of you have probably read some of his books. One of his more recent books is Nature's Best Hope, which really outlines more actionable steps you can take as a backyard gardener in order to foster wildlife habitat. And so rewilding is based on a lot of that, what's pointed out in that book, as well as a lot of Douglas Tallamy's research about insect and plant interactions and their importance for local food webs, because many of the insects that feed on native plants are essential to songbirds, especially in the spring when they're feeding their young. They feed them on a very protein-rich diet, especially of caterpillars. And it's actually just amazing when you start to unravel and learn about that web of life that's hosted on native plants, the moth and butterfly caterpillars especially. of which Doug Tellemy's research has focused on. So the first action step in rewilding is really, or sorry, the second one is really to shrink your lawn. The first is to plant native trees. But if you think about it, lawns take up a huge portion of our landscapes in the suburbs and urban areas of the United States. Lawns are the second most irrigated crop. And that means a lot. They really are devoid of a lot of wildlife habitat, and they contribute pollution through fertilizers and pesticides into water bodies, as stormwater runoff picks up those pollutants, it takes them into water bodies and can cause things like toxic algal blooms and all sorts of other hazards for both people and wildlife. So Doug Tallamy points out that if all of us decreased our lawn even just by half, then we'd be in a lot better shape environmentally and ecologically. So as a nation. So, I think just starting by thinking about, ways that we can start to incrementally decrease our lawn is a good idea. You can start by, not mowing certain portions of your lawn and allowing that kind of unmowed edge to be a really beautiful frame for a gathering space, place for recreation, or a pathway through your landscape. You can create those outdoor rooms and pathways that look like this. That I think that this is a nice way to think of it, as kind of the lawn as the negative space, maybe in your landscape. It is important, it does serve a function. It's very walkable, but you could replace that, a good portion of it, with native plantings, or just stop mowing portions of it. So I really like to think about, why mow when you can meadow, or you can create layers of native plants, which is even better. But meadows, in and of themselves, have lots of flowering opportunities, opportunities for pollinators with their nectar and pollen. And you can get big shows of flowering, especially meadows kind of have their concentration of bloom times towards the end of the summer and early fall, with things like New York ironweeds and Joe Pye weeds, sneeze weeds, and different types of sunflowers like woodland sunflower, as well as asters and goldenrods. But we also, not all of us have space for meadows in our yards, and it's great to add layers, if possible, of native trees and shrubs, vines, containers of some of those plants if you don't have space as well. I personally actually just have a front stoop, some steps that I put container plants on with wild strawberry and coneflowers and things like that, in order to foster any little bit of wildlife habitat in my front yard in my apartment. But I love this small space in Portland, Maine, that it's a really nicely designed garden patio. And there are just, there's vines, there's the trumpet honeysuckle, there's bush honeysuckle, there's in this container in the back corner, there's aromatic sumac that's trained as kind of like a bonsai-like shrub. There's asters and coneflowers and goldenrods, and so New England asters. There's a lot of biodiversity here that is just in this very small space. So everything's stacked, packed, and layered, cramming as much as you can into a small space. And Doug Tellamy also points to this threshold of 70% native plant biomass that we actually need in order to keep those food webs intact. And I'll talk a little bit more later about how all of that works. What are those food webs? What are the different pollinators and other creatures that are relying on native plants, and how can you think about fostering those in your landscape? But I just want to kind of impress on you that it's important to have as many native plants as you can fit into your landscape, though it doesn't mean that you have to go all or nothing and have only native plants and be a purist. I actually like the idea of, if a plant is meaningful to you, like a lilac that was passed down to you by a grandmother, or something like that, then why not keep it if it's not doing any harm? But we can kind of push the envelope on other new plantings that we put in our landscapes. So, the first action step actually in rewilding is to plant native trees because they contain so much of that native plant biomass. They're in their leafy branches, their root systems, even underground, their trunks. And some of these native trees are actually what Doug Tellamy would consider keystone plants: the oaks, willows, cherries, as well as plums. Plums fall into the same family as cherries, birches and poplars. And you could plant some of these, the shrub species of these families, if you don't have the space for a large tree, or smaller trees like a beach plum. But I like this example of the black cherry. When I was at Garden in the Woods in Framingham, Massachusetts, I had the pleasure of getting to raise both silk moths and butterflies. And our native silk moths can be really beautiful. It's just that we don't come into contact with them all that frequently, because when they're their winged adult stage, they spend just a couple days like that. And they're really, in that stage, they're just looking to mate for the most part. They actually don't even eat. They don't feed on nectar or pollen from flowers. So they're not, these particular species like the Cecropia silk moth are not pollinators per se, but I still would classify them in that, just because they contribute a lot ecologically. Caterpillars are really important, as I said earlier, for as a protein source for songbirds, and especially when they're feeding their young in spring. So the life cycle of the Cecropia silk moth is that it closes or hatches from its cocoon in late spring, so somewhere around May or June. And then it reproduces. The male will fly up to a mile or two away to find the female by pheromones using its antennae. And then they'll find the female and they'll mate. And then a couple days later, the females will lay eggs on the host plants that they prefer. So these host plants are often many different species of native trees, and cherry is a significant host plant for a number of different moth and butterfly caterpillars. The Cecropia silk moth is not just beautiful as its winged adult stage, but it's also a really cool looking caterpillar. It's kind of smooth looking, but with these, you can see in this picture, these little spikes with red, orange, and blue balls at the end of them. And as it matures, it changes a little bit. The caterpillars go through different instar stages and take on different looks. So they can look a little different from a young caterpillar to an older one. They feed on their host plant's leaves for a good portion of the growing season. And then late, usually in around August, they pupate. And Cecropia silk moths actually pupate and spin their cocoons hanging from a branch of a tree. While a lot of other silk moths, like the Luna moth, will actually overwinter under the leaf litter. So they'll drop down from the trees and spin their cocoons in the leaf litter, where they can actually be a lot more vulnerable. And if you want to learn more about native trees and some of the different species of native trees that we would recommend from Wild Seed Project, I suggest you check out the annual publication that came out this year called Native Trees for Northeast Landscapes. It's a Wild Seed Project guide, and we're hoping to produce more guides as the years go on that can help you figure out how to, cover the different layers in your landscape, like the trees, the shrubs, and the ground covers, as well as other how-to kind of information that you might want for planting native plants. I also would suggest within those layers that some of the herbaceous or perennial plants that you plant be in the aster family, and specifically asters and goldenrods are also keystone plants. So anything that's Asteraceae is going to foster a lot of wildlife, but both goldenrods and asters host at least, a couple hundred, if not more, different species of moth and butterfly caterpillars on their leaves. They're what you call larval host plants, but they also are really essential as late season forage for nectar and pollen for bees and wasps and other pollinators that require that in August and September. before to get their last, sips of energy before they go dormant or overwinter, either in the leaf litter or in plant stems. So I like to say that there's a goldenrod for every garden, and as well as an aster. And there's also, every garden should have an aster and a goldenrod, at least one species of each. And I say there's a goldenrod and an aster for every garden because there's so many different species. And we may recognize some of the more weedy ones that grow in our landscape, like the Canada goldenrod that's often seen in big, open fields or on roadsides. That's a native goldenrod, but it is a little bit more aggressive than than a lot of other species. There's some really lovely garden-worthy goldenrods that I think deserve a place in many different gardens, like the zigzag goldenrod and the wreath goldenrod. The flaxleaf stiff aster is nice and short and upright, and it doesn't get kind of as wild looking. It's very gardeny. It has kind of slightly glossy leaves, and it also, the fall foliage is really lovely too. It's very floriferous. That thrives in more sandy soils and full sun, whereas the bluewood aster and the wreath goldenrod thrive in dry, shady soils. You could kind of push it and put them in a little bit more sun too. And then the zigzag goldenrod does better in more moist, shady soils or conditions. But also goldenrods have kind of gotten a reputation for causing allergies, which is false. Goldenrods don't actually cause our fall allergies because they're animal pollinated, because their pollen is really heavy and wants to stick and be sticky and stick to the knees and the bodies of bees, rather than blow through the wind and kind of be airborne and getting into our noses. So there's other things that bloom at the same time as a lot of those asters and goldenrods, like ragweed and grasses, and those are more likely causing a lot of our fall allergies. So this is kind of concluding what you plant. That's really important. What you plant is important. Where you source your plants from is essential actually as well. So, for pollinators, finding those plants that are grown without the use of systemic pesticides is essential. Those neonicotinoids actually are used in many nursery settings. So you kind of have to inquire with each individual nursery about, if they use neonicotinoids on any of their plants. And sometimes you have to inquire about the specific plant because they may say they don't overall, but they may for some others. Even if they use integrated pest management, they still might use neonicotinoids. And that's important because those will go into the vascular system of the plant, and they can be present there for a couple years or more. So when you plant it out into the landscape, your plant will potentially still have pesticides that the pollinators and the moths and the butterflies and their caterpillars might be eating. And that works its way up the food chain. So as well, I would say, if you can, I'd say the priority is making sure that plants are grown without systemic pesticides if possible. And then secondly, I think if you can find plants that are grown from seed, that ensures that the plants are have a lot of resilience, because a plant grown from seed, each new generation of plant is going to be very different from the last generation. So a seedling that might come from a plant that you planted in your garden from Home Depot will not be quite as resilient as a seedling that you planted that came from a seed grown plant, because it's going to have more genetic variability within it, and thus more resilience against things like climate change stressors, drought and flooding, and the hot summers that we are having more and more in Massachusetts and Maine. So you can try to find your own plants, grown from seed, or grow your own. And I actually we have a lot of recommended nurseries. We have also a blog post on some of the nurseries that we recommend and the ways that you can kind of find out the best plants to find in the nurseries, because it can be a very tricky thing to do. So that's in a blog post called Navigating the Nurseries on our website. And then we also have a where to buy native plants page. It's linked from Navigating the Nurseries. And this page is kind of broken down by state. So you can look at your state and find as many nurseries as possible. Sometimes it might be essential to kind of look outside of your state. If you know, in Maine, we have limited resources for where we can find native plants to grow. Maine is a little bit behind some of the rest of New England, but it's catching up as more education about native plants gets out there and people start demanding more native plants in their landscape. So, you know, Wild Seed Project was founded partially because there weren't enough resources for people about native plants, and there wasn't enough supply. So I think as we increase those resources, the demand will increase and the supply will increase. And hopefully people can kind of demand that plants are grown in the best way possible too, that we get high quality plants. So check that out for sure. Now, I've mentioned that what we plant is just as important as how we manage those plantings. So there's a lot of different things that we can do throughout the year that or not do that will increase opportunities for pollinators to overwinter and live out their life cycles, as well as things that are just going to be more beneficial overall. And I like looking at, you know, if you're unsure about how to approach this, I like the idea of looking at maybe one pollinator that you're especially interested in and learning its life cycle in order to know how to manage your landscape to keep it there and to keep it persisting, its populations persisting year after year. So the checker spot, the Baltimore checker spot, is a really great example. Its host plant is the white turtlehead. It also has a couple other host plants, but the white turtlehead is its primary host plant. It lays its eggs on the turtlehead in spring, and it will lay its eggs on the underside of the leaves, and they'll all hatch at once. And the caterpillars are gregarious. So especially when they're very small, they'll form this kind of protective webbing around them. And they'll also use that webbing to kind of transport them from one branch to another. So as they munch and eat all the leaves on one branch and finish that branch off, they'll go to another branch to start again. And I've seen this. They kind of have these like bridges from one branch to another. It's pretty cool looking. It might look kind of messy, which is, you know, something that goes with the territory. It might look like this is a pest or something like that. There's a webbing on your branches, the leaves are getting eaten. But I think it's important to not necessarily every time we look at a plant getting eaten or see something happening with an insect in our gardens, to not necessarily just automatically think it's a pest. A lot of the time that's kind of ingrained from us or in us from our backgrounds in ornamental horticulture, and to think of insects as pests. But in this case, insects can be beneficial. So these caterpillars feed on the leaves for that whole growing season, and then they crawl down to the base of the plant and actually overwinter under the leaf litter. Then the next year, they actually are still caterpillars. They crawl up the plant again and munch for a little while longer and pupate about early summer into these gorgeous cocoons. And then they start the cycle over again. So you can see why leaf litter, what we call litter, is really essential to both the Baltimore checker spot butterfly as well as the Luna moth. And it's important for other creatures as well. Frogs, many frogs and salamanders overwinter under the leaf litter or spend a good portion of their lives under the leaf litter. So do bumblebees, actually. Bumblebees, many species of bumblebees have nests under the leaf litter. And our Leave the Leaves sign illustrates this really well. So leaves can really help sustain, or leaves and all the different things that you leave up potentially during the winter can help sustain birds and protect those overwintering pollinators. They also insulate plant roots. So in years that we don't have a lot of snow, especially more and more recently with climate change, we don't have that insulating layer of snow. Leaves can provide a lot of that insulation. And then they also break down and build living soil. So I argue actually, oh, we have a blog post on leaving the leaves that I wrote last year. So please check it out because it goes into a lot more depth even, I think, than I can get into in this presentation. About a lot of the things that I'm talking about today. So, leaving the leaves is really essential for a number of reasons, and it causes us to think about how we might unlearn a lot of our gardening practices of cleaning leaves up and taking them away, because they make a great garden mulch, and they do all these ecological services for us. It's actually my preference to not buy in mulch from outside, because a lot of this mulch is dyed, and those dyes kind of bleed out and leach into the water table. A lot of the mulches are brought in from elsewhere, which anytime you bring a material in from elsewhere, you're having to consider that you could be transporting invasive insects or diseases of some sort, or invasive plants. Like I've transported in bittersweet from mulch that I've gotten into gardens before, the bittersweet plant. And because that's often, around our suburban habitats already, and we could be spreading it around. So leaves also, they're a precious resource that we don't want to take away necessarily. Oftentimes they're getting pushed into deeper layers into the woods, which is not the worst thing that you can do with them, but if you could be using them in your garden beds, why not? Oftentimes they're taken away to composting facilities, and that's also not the worst thing, but I would prefer to keep them on site if possible. I think one of the reasons that we take our leaves away is because we believe that there's not enough space to keep them. So, which is true in a lot of our urban and suburban areas where we have lots of blacktop or in those impervious surfaces where we can't allow organic matter to break down and clog sewer drains and things like that. Or we have too much lawn, and the lawn will get smothered by all the leaves. So there's just not enough spaces to put the leaves. But one of the first solutions is if you shrink your lawn and have more garden bed space, then you'll have more places to accommodate those leaves. It is harder in much smaller suburban areas. This is a really great kind of way to think about, leaves as mulch, especially underneath trees. When those pollinators pupate and drop down into the leaf litter, they often come down from the trees that they've been feeding on all season. And it's important to, especially under trees, leave those leaves. Oops. So I wanted to just mention some of those things that we might do to contain our leaves. And I'll keep talking about this, but I'm just gonna kind of interrupt for a minute by mentioning, all the different things that we have to consider when putting our gardens to bed in the fall. Pollinator value, we have to consider aesthetic appeal. How does it look to our neighbors? Does it look like we're just kind of leaving things unmanaged and uncared for, or how can we make it look cared for? And then our workload management, because, if we leave our leaves in the fall, does that mean it makes more work in the spring? Maybe, maybe not. I think that depends on a number of things. So one of the things that we can do to kind of consolidate our leaves, if we feel like we still, even after removing a good portion of our lawn and replacing it with garden bed, and we still don't have enough spaces for the leaves to go, then we can kind of consolidate them and compost them. So you can put them in a compost pile. You could make a separate compost pile for leaves and let them break down naturally. Aged leaves make a really great garden mulch, and then they break down and build living soil. Or you can put them in a compost or a leaf fence. And this is illustrated at Garden in the Woods. This is a while ago at Garden in the Woods, before I even worked there. This is Tom Smar, one of the past garden directors of Garden in the Woods, or horticulture directors, working with volunteers to create a living fence or a leaf fence that created a boundary that they were hoping to create in their idea garden. And when you add leaves to a fence like this, they're basically just these columns of either chicken wire or hardware cloth, something like that, that are coiled up, and then you can stuff the leaves into them. But when you do this, they actually break down really fast, and you'll be surprised at how quickly the leaves actually disappear and become really nice compost, or that middle ground before they've fully broken down, they make a really great mulch. And actually, you could even passively create kind of a leaf to living fence. This is the family activity area at Garden in the Woods. And this was an experiment creating kind of a leaf fence where every year we take the excess leaves from off the wood chip area and put them in and off the garden paths and put them in this living fence. And you can see actually we were struggling to kind of fill up that fence because the leaves would break down so fast. But towards the bottom, especially, you get this really nice rich layer of compost. And then we actually had some neighboring plantings that contributed seeds and created a living fence by seeding in. So this is the wood poppy, the native wood poppy. And then in other areas, lots of asters and goldenrod seeded in. And it was kind of a nice little surprise to have those plants seeding into those areas. Another option for those of us that are not quite ready to go all the way and leave our leaves, or figure out a way to kind of compost them and then put them back on the garden beds, is to shred your leaves. And I did a lot of this when I worked at Garden in the Woods, especially I started out there as an intern, and the interns were on the leaf shredder constantly. At the time that I was an intern, it was 2010, so it was a little while ago, but we spent about a month on either end, like of the growing season. So the fall and the spring, shredding leaves. We would blow all the leaves off the garden beds into these runnels in the garden paths, and take this trailer shredder with our electric vehicles down the garden paths and suck up the leaves in a vacuum and shred them. And then we would have so many leaves that we would sometimes put them back on the garden beds, a thin layer to kind of overwinter and create some insulation for the gardens over the winter. But we'd have an excess, so we would put them in a pile and they'd further break down. And then we'd do lots of mulching with those shredded leaves on all the garden beds in spring before the ephemerals and all the new plants came up. We mainly did that practice for a number of years because it was believed that aesthetically it looked a lot nicer to have those shredded leaves on our garden beds. And it was also there's a belief that, the plants wouldn't be able to pierce through whole leaves. And that's actually not necessarily true. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But it did look a little nicer, but unfortunately at Garden in the Woods, we had an invasive worm. That we had the the European earthworm, as well as later on we got the Asian jumping worm. And both of those worms were breaking down our leaves so quickly that we didn't have any mulch left in our gardens by the middle of the season. So that was a real problem. So we decided to move away from using that gas-powered shredder, move away from fossil fuels and all the mowing and blowing that we did, and start leaving more whole leaves on the garden beds. And the compromise that we first came to was that we would pull the leaves out of the edges of the garden beds and where they were really piled up, and shred those, and then put them back on the edges, making a nice fluffy edge of shredded leaves, but leave the interior garden beds alone and leave those leaves whole. And I think that's a better practice for pollinators that overwinter there, because you could be taking those pollinators and shredding them, which would definitely disrupt their life cycle. And so it's not the best practice to do that either. But it's kind of a middle ground if you feel like you still are going to have excess leaves. And in the meantime, before you have a chance to create more garden beds instead of lawn. So, there's also another great method that I was taught by Uli Lorimer, who's our most recent director of horticulture at Garden in the Woods. He's still the director right now. He worked at Brooklyn Botanical Garden for 14 years. And he also worked at Wave Hill in the Bronx for a couple years and worked in their woodland garden. And he learned a lot because he was working on the natural areas and native plant gardens. A lot of them are wooded, a lot of the time by himself because they were pretty understaffed for the native plant areas. So he had to kind of find methods that were less work for him to manage those garden plantings on his own, or maybe with one other volunteer or intern. So he found that if he kind of tweaked his garden design a little bit, he could do a little bit less work. So in the higher convex portions of the landscape, like the little hills, like that's in this photo, he would often plant ground covers or more delicate stemmed plants that had no trouble coming up, or that have trouble coming up through leaf litter that would probably get smothered by leaf litter. And he would remove the leaf litter from, the interior of dense shrubs. A lot of it gets caught there, or from the edges of fences where, the leaves might blow. But the leaves don't want to stay on those kind of convex shapes. They want to blow off of it. So it's always hard getting a leaf to stay on, to kind of stay on these rock garden areas. They would get nestled into the cracks of the rocks and everything. So you do have to clean them out of there, but you can wait until spring to do that before too many plants have started really coming out yet. So that's my method, is I wait until spring to do a lot of that extra leaf cleanup, and because the leaves are going to blow around in the fall and the winter. And you're just going to have to do it all over again in spring if you don't do it if you do it in the fall. Another thing is, in the lower sections of the landscape, the concave portions, like the little valleys and areas like that, that's oftentimes where the leaves get kind of concentrated and you might have an excess of leaves. So more than 4 to 6 inches is probably a little bit of an excess. Those areas might need to be cleaned out a little bit more, and I would wait until the early spring to do that. There's a window of time that you want to do that before too much emergence comes up, so you're not stepping on other plants. But you can design your garden beds so that you have the more strong stemmed plants growing in those lower areas where there's a lot more leaf litter, and then the more ground covers and weaker stemmed plants in those higher, drier areas. That is one way to approach it. So for instance, those plants that can kind of bust up through the leaf litter with no problem are things like the baneberries and black bugbane, or black cohosh is another name for that, the cone flowers, the snake fruits. A lot of asters and goldenrods can come up through those no problem. Whereas a lot of the ones that have trouble maybe making it up through leaf litter are things like phlox and some ephemerals, not all of them, and things like nodding onion, things that are shorter and just have weaker stems. So here's an example of a lot of the spring emergence at Garden in the Woods. And a lot of the ephemerals actually were very good at coming up, or are very good at coming up through leaf litter. Even the spring beauty, you can see on the top left, is coming up through a thick layer of mulch. I think 4 to 6 inches is actually pretty standard because it's nice and fluffy, so it puffs up a lot. Trout lilies have no problem coming up through leaf litter. the Virginia bluebells, the blue cohosh, and the early meadow rue. Those are just a couple examples of the plants coming up through leaf litter. So next, I want to talk about other materials that fall to the forest floor, and ways that you can manage them, things you can do with them rather than clean them up, because things like fallen logs and sticks are really important sources of carbon for something like chicken of the woods, that edible mushroom to grow on, or mosses, lichens. And underneath, if you push over a log, underneath the log, you'll find millipedes and salamanders and all sorts of creatures that live under logs as a way to find protection or feed off of the logs. A lot of the decomposers are really dependent on the sticks and leaves and logs that fall to the forest floor. So, and they can be beautiful too. I think it's really nice when a log falls into a water body, because it starts getting really mossy if it's kept nice and moist most of the time by being soaked in water. And it can be a beautiful feature that you can have in your landscape. You don't necessarily always have to clean it up. And you can get creative with ways to maybe rearrange some of those sticks and logs without pulling them out of the landscape. So this hidden valley sculpture at Garden in the Woods illustrates this really well. It's a sinuous line that goes through a little valley at Garden in the Woods. It goes up and down the slopes. And so I think it really accentuates the slopes of the valley. It's made all with fallen logs. I think it was created actually initially by Gary Smith, who's a designer of a lot of ecological gardens and public gardens throughout the US. So he's worked on gardens in New York and Canada, and worked on children's gardens. He also did the design for the Curtis Woodland Garden at Garden in the Woods. So he came in an afternoon and worked with volunteers to just pull all the fallen logs that didn't have all the branchy, leafy branches on them, the ones that were kind of more bare without too many extra branches on them, and pull them into this shape. And then every year at Garden in the Woods since, we would go and kind of add to it, because it would break down over time, and we would just add back onto this sculpture. And so I've seen other volunteers of ours or other members from Garden in the Woods make their own little miniature Garden in the Woods or Hidden Valley sculpture by doing this in their backyards. You can also collect sticks and make little piles that will create more wildlife habitat too. Or you can make a wattle fence in this lower right-hand corner. This is a really high quality wattle fence made with all, it looks like it was more like prunings, maybe from willows or something like that. But that's another thing I like to do if I've pruned a lot of plants in the winter, especially of particular shrubs. If it's the young whips and they don't have a lot of branches on them, I can kind of make them into a nice wattle fence by weaving them around other sticks that are planted in the ground. So those are really fun things to do, and ways to get creative. And you can work on this in the winter at a time, or in the fall when there's not a lot of other gardening things to do. Also, thinking about changing your lawn to meadow, I want you to think about, if you do have a meadow area or a garden bed with taller perennial plants, of not necessarily cutting those plants back to the ground at particular times of year. So during the growing season, I'll walk you through some of the things that I do cut back and some of the things that I don't cut back, and why. And if you can, leave a lot of that standing vegetation up through the winter, then you're going to create more habitat for birds and, to find forage like seeds from coneflowers, and protection. Birds really require having some places to hide in evergreen shrubs or standing vegetation from predators, and find cover. And then, you can put up signs to kind of make your neighbors more aware of what you're doing so that, it doesn't look like you're just neglecting your yard. So there's our leave the leaves sign for the leafy areas. And then there's a great native habitat sign that says do not mow for some of those areas that, you're leaving standing vegetation over the winter or any time of year. I like putting up the do not mow sign in areas where I'm reducing lawn, because I actually have a neighbor. My mom's house, I do a lot of gardening, and she has a neighbor that likes to come and mow her lawn as a nice neighborly gesture. And if I have a sign up like this, then he knows not to mow certain areas of the lawn that I'm trying to have go to meadow, or that am converting to meadow or other layers of vegetation. And check out these yard signs. They're available on the Wild Seed Project website. And I think a yard sign is a great way in general to let people know that you're doing something in a subtle way. So maybe instead of, trying to convert all your neighbors to do what you're doing, it can be a more passive way to spark conversation, to get people interested in what you're doing, and to understand a little bit more about what you're doing in your landscape. So there are other things to consider when you're leaving some of that standing vegetation, but if you want something to reseed, if you want to encourage that or not. So there might be plants like the northern sea oats, which is a lovely native plant. It has this amazing flattened seed head that waves in the wind, and that's one of the reasons people plant it. At Garden in the Woods, we did have it planted in an area that we didn't want it can be a little bit more aggressive, and we didn't want it to reseed everywhere. So we ended up waiting for the plant to form its beautiful seed heads and get a chance to see them. But then we did cut them back before the seeds turned kind of their coppery brown and were viable. So it prevented a good amount of them from seeding into the surrounding area. So you might consider that you do cut back plants that you don't want to seed around because they might be a little aggressive. Or maybe you want things to seed around so that you get more common milkweed in a larger area, or goldenrod, something like that. I also love the ornamental bushy seed heads of bushy blue stem. If you don't know this plant, there is a good planting of it at Garden in the Woods in their meadow. And it turns this gorgeous salmon pink color, and it's called bushy blue stem because one of the reasons people plant it is that for its bushy seed heads that are just so beautiful. They stay nice and upright. It's not a very tall grass. It stays somewhat low. And it's just a gorgeous grass for a variety of situations. It likes full sun and moist, medium to moist soils. So I wouldn't cut this seed back yet. I also like to leave the opportunity to collect some of the seeds if I want to do that in my garden, and then resow them and plant them, make more plants and plant them again out into my landscape. And for birds and other wildlife to find the forage in those seeds. So, consider what you want to leave up, what you want to cut back for this reason. And also, I think planting in the first place plants that have pithy or hollow stems is always a good idea, because those create really lovely chambers that a lot of our native bees can lay their eggs in. So native bees will lay their eggs in about maybe up to even 30 in a row, with a little packet of food, that usually nectar from or honey. And then they'll put like a little wax behind it, so you'll have them stacked up that way. And then they'll hatch in. Sometimes some bees hatch in the spring, some hatch at a different point during the growing season. If you cut your plants back, the ones that are kind of hollow and pithy, you could cut them back to just not lower than 18 inches to the ground, because that will provide enough space for those nesting bee sites. But I think the common elder is a good plant for that. Joe pieweed, flowering raspberry. A lot of those plants and the related plants to them have those pithy or hollow stems. This is an illustration or an infographic on Heather Holmes' website. I definitely suggest visiting this website. She's done a lot of great research and has really wonderful resources for people looking to support more pollinators in their landscape. And she actually lays out that a way that you can cut back plants and still have a chance to cut back those plants, but if you want to kind of clean up a little bit more in the winter, but not cut them back too low. So if you cut them back at varying heights, you leave them up through the winter to provide some habitat. Then in spring, you can cut them back. And then actually a lot of the bees will nest in spring. They'll be in there through the growing season. By the middle of the summer, those plants have risen up above those stems. Their emergence has come up and covered up those stems that you left up. So you won't even really be able to see them by then. It hides that kind of the dead stems. And then a lot of bees will come out during the growing season or go back into those stems and hibernate in them during the fall. So if you just keep this cycle going of cutting, maybe doing most of your cutbacks for those stems in the spring, then that's a good way to go about it. It's a good rule of thumb to leave things up for the winter and then cut them back in the spring, but not too low. I also, it's okay to cut plants back that are flopping to the ground, that have weak stems, that just have leaves that are not going to be providing a lot of opportunities for cover and forage. So, some of my plants just don't look very good in the winter. So I'll leave the structural plants up, the Joe Pye weeds and the elderberries and things like that stay up nice and upright or have seed heads. But then I'll cut back the ones that just start to look a little bad, get crispy and don't look as good. So you can come to a compromise. You don't have to leave everything up and you don't have to cut everything back. You can kind of be somewhere in the middle. Other ways to provide nesting opportunities for bees is a lot of our native bees nest in the ground, especially in sandy soils, and our native wasps. And these are not necessarily the bees and wasps that some of them are, but these are not mostly the bees and wasps that sting you. I think the yellow jackets are ground nesting bees. And in that case, I don't like having habitat for them around. So if I see a yellow jacket nest or I see, yellow jackets coming out of it, I will not favor that as a nesting site. But there are other things like the black wasp, the great black wasp. It's a wasp that digs holes in the ground and nests in there, and they'll live there throughout the course of the winter and growing season, that are really beautiful. They don't have an interest in stinging us. Only if, we stepped on their nest would they maybe sting us. And they are really concentrated pollinators. So they love plants like spotted bee balm. I always see these, they're very blue and iridescent. So if you see this elongated body with blue iridescent wings and body, that's probably the great black wasp pollinating a spotted bee balm. It's really beautiful. And sandy soils are also important for things like the painted turtle, that if you live near a water body, you might have, and you have sandy soil, you might have painted turtles or other species of turtles coming and laying their eggs in the sandy soil. So leaving some open patches of soil in these areas is not a bad idea. Overall, we can work to add more opportunities in our landscapes and decrease harm. So those bee nesting sites, thinking about those plants to leave up, leaving deadwood. Deadwood is actually really great for bee nesting sites, as well as some open sandy areas. If you have it, is great. I kind of shy away from recommending those bee hotels that have become really popular recently. They're not a bad thing. I think they can be a nice educational tool, but you have to be very vigilant about cleaning them out every year, because they can actually foster disease and fungal pathogens in them. And if the materials are not fresh and new each year, then you could actually be doing more harm to your bees than good. So something to keep in mind. Bat and bird boxes are really important to have in your landscape. If you have especially meadow areas, I think Bluebird boxes are great to have. You want to make sure for a bluebird box that you have at least two about 10 feet apart, if not more, because the tree swallows like to inhabit those boxes and are very territorial. They'll push out the bluebirds. So if you have tree swallows nearby, especially if you have two boxes, they're territorial. So the tree swallows will not allow another family of tree swallows in the box next door. So you'll have one box for the tree swallows, one box for the bluebirds. Water bubblers and bird baths are important to have, especially in the spring and fall for migrating birds. And if something's making a gurgling sound or you can hear water running, that's even better. So if you happen to have like a little waterfall or bubbler, that's a nice idea because the birds will be attracted by the sound. And if they have native plants to forage on as well, and the insects and those that are foraging on those native plants, then they'll have more reason to stop by your yard. Motion sensor lights are a good way to go. Just these little tweaks that are not necessarily all gardening things, but some of them improve opportunities and decrease harm in your landscape. So motion sensor lights are important because the moths mainly travel at night and they get distracted by light and get pulled to it instead of doing what they're probably trying to do, which is go find a mate to reproduce with. So it's important to minimize light in your landscape as much as possible. So I actually think a motion sensor light's a better idea than a big street light or a light that you keep on outside all night. And window well covers are kind of a nice thing to have for preventing some of those frogs and salamanders and other small creatures from falling into the window wells and not being able to get back out. That's a really simple, easy thing to do, is just to remember to keep your window well covers on if you have a basement window. And then finally, if you have the means or the ability to do deer fencing, if you have a small enough landscape where it makes it worthwhile, that is going to actually keep deer out of your landscape because they're feeding on all the new emerging seedlings and herbaceous layer in our woodlands and changing the future composition of our forests. Unfortunately, they eat a lot of our plants. You know, we find them to be pests in gardens, but they're actually detrimental to the new forests that will become forests over the next 100 years or so. And it's because we have too many deer in our landscapes. That's another kind of topic. I could go into more detail with that in the Q&A if you like, but I don't need to get into that in too much detail right now. But it's a good idea to, you know, when you have a new planting of a tree or a shrub, to put like a small deer fencing around it, or to be able to fence in your larger landscape from deer with at least an 8-foot fence so that they can't jump over. And that's all I have for today. I'm happy to go into any more detail with you about the different types of ways that we can manage our landscapes, leaving the leaves or leaving stems up, if you have questions about that. And I also want to mention that if you are inclined and have not yet, I think taking our Pledge to Rewild, if you go to the Wild Seed Project website and it's at the top, Pledge to Rewild, that's actually free. You can sign up and you just put in information like your city and state and how much acreage you have. That information is not used to share with anyone, but we do put your site on a map that just shares your zip code. And then so that can kind of help show our collective impact to all the people that are taking that Pledge to Rewild. And in turn, you also get a series of emails with information and step-by-step guidance and links to learning more about doing everything that I talked about today and more in your landscape to increase native plants and wildlife habitat in your yards. So thank you everyone very much. I'll leave you with kind of showing you through some of the resource slides that I have here, some further reading. And I'll go back to these if you like, and our native gardening blog, and then our final slide. So thanks everyone. I'm open to Q&A now.
Thank you very much, Anna. That is wonderful. Any questions for Anna? I
I
don't
have.
see any in the chat.
Ready?
Yes, go ahead.
I leave all the debris on the gardens in the winter, but I have a bad habit of wanting to clean as soon as I can in the spring. So when should I leave them?
That's a good question. Yeah, so in spring there's still a fair amount of time where those pollinators and other creatures are not fully woken up yet. I would say a good time is a little bit before too many shoots start to come up. So maybe when some ephemerals and things like if you have snowdrops in your garden.
Horse pasture.
Yeah, that's a good indication of a good time you can start doing a little bit more cleanup. I would save it till like right before the plant shoots really start to come up if possible.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Yeah, if you wait as long as possible, that's going to give those creatures more time to come out. And I think I'm forgetting right now exactly what temperature those native bees get, but they get triggered by a certain temperature. I think it might be like 60 and above or something like that, before the young bees start to come out of those stems. So I would just leave, that's why I like the Heather Home illustration, because you can cut back those stems, but leave them up at least 18 inches. And you can leave some of varying heights. And then by the middle of the summer, the echinaceas, coneflowers, and the Joe Pye weeds and things like that will have hidden those stems, so you won't even see them anymore.
So
Excuse me, Anna, could
couple of
you stop sharing your screen and then we can all see everybody?
Sure, that sounds good. And
Thank
would
you.
you like me to call on folks instead?
No, in the chat, there are a couple of questions. You might, there's
Okay.
one on,
Yeah, hopefully everybody will be raising their hand. So
right.
Okay, great. That sounds good. All right, I stopped sharing. And I'll go through some of the questions in the chat right now. So we have a question about recommendations for planting seeds in existing meadow with no bare ground. It was a former horse pasture. Yeah, so I wouldn't recommend just planting most seeds directly into the ground, because for the most part, especially if there's no bare soil in an unprepared garden bed, where there's a lot of weed competition, it's going to be really hard for those seeds to take hold in the soil and get going, as well as a lot of them will be lost by getting washed away, eaten by animals, and just the competition. So my recommendation for seed sowing is really to just, if you have a prepared garden bed, if you've done, say, something called sheet mulching, where you've laid down cardboard and maybe a little bit of topsoil and some mulch, you can lay that down in, say, spring, and then sow seeds of things like black-eyed Susan and partridge pea in late fall, and then they'll emerge in the early growing season, and that will hold the ground as you get ready to plant more longer lived plants in there. Those are fast growing plants that I think would do well from kind of broadcasting seed, but still only in prepared ground. Grasses also would do a little bit better that way than a lot of other plants. Otherwise, I would recommend sowing your seeds as we recommend on our website. So there's actually a really great couple of great resources, blog posts called Seed Sowing in 6 Easy Steps, or Autumn and Winter Seed Sowing in 6 Easy Steps. That's going to walk you through everything you need to know about sowing seeds, especially the ones that you get from us. You sow them into pots in the winter or late fall, let them germinate in spring, and you can grow them let them get a little bit bigger throughout the course of the growing season. And then you can plant them either in the fall or the following spring. And if you plant them as seedlings or as small plants, they're going to have a much better chance of making it long term. Okay, so another question is, When the caterpillars eat the plant leaves in the spring, does that kill the plant? Is there a conflict of interest? That's a really good question too. I'd say if you have a lot of native plants, each native plant is not going to have so many different caterpillars eating so many leaves that that they're going to have trouble surviving. I think it can be a little bit of a problem actually when you're first establishing some of your native plantings. So you may, it kind of sounds counterintuitive, but you may need to keep some of the pollinators off your plants, or those caterpillars off your plants when you're planting new young, say, pussy toes, for example, because so the plant pussy toes has the American lady butterfly hosts on pussy toes, and it lays its eggs on pussy toes in the spring, and then they hatch and eat the foliage, and it can be very defoliated by the early summer. But then they have a chance to resprout and regenerate and send up new shoots and recover for the rest of the growing season. So if you see something feeding on your pussy toes, that's not a problem. It's just something that's going to happen. But if you have a newly planted plant and you just have one or something like that, and you have all these American lady butterflies that found that one plant, then it could keep the plant from really establishing well. So I have seen, that happen a little bit with new plants. It also has happened when I've planted white turtlehead at Garden in the Woods, because we introduced the Baltimore checker spot there. It wasn't there before. And the Baltimore checker spot did really well the first year because there was enough turtlehead to support it. But then the following years, the Baltimore checker spot populations would keep growing, and the turtlehead, we didn't have enough plants. So it was kind of like, we didn't have enough plants to support their population. So that won't happen for the most part if you have good established plantings, but when you're first getting things established, it's something to consider. Overall, I think it tends to balance out, like especially with all the creatures that eat the leaves of trees. I think, trees have so many leaves on them that it's not usually a problem. Whereas we do have invasive moths, like in Massachusetts and parts of Maine, the winter moth has been a problem, and gypsy moth. And in Maine, we have the brown-tailed moth in southern Maine. So those are invasive moths that their populations are a little out of control, and they don't have a specific host, and they will defoliate plants. And if it happens year after year after year, then it becomes a problem for the health of the plant. 1 year is not usually that big of a deal for a tree, but that is where we do have cause for concern. The birds are not able to keep up with eating all those invasive moths. So, that is something that it gets checks and balances through maybe like different fungal pathogens, that if we have a wet year, like say the gypsy moth has a fungal pathogen that attacks it on wet years, especially a wet spring, it won't come back as in higher populations the following year after a wet spring. But during times of drought, that exacerbates the gypsy moth problem, and they'll come back roaring back after a droughty year. So it goes in kind of cycles, and I think climate change exacerbates a lot of those issues. That's getting a little deeper into it than I necessarily needed to get into it, but I thought it was an important thing to bring up. Okay, does somebody else want to ask a question out loud? Somebody who has their hand up, like Kathy Simmons?
I was the first question and you've answered it. Sorry,
Okay,
I forgot to lower my hand. I will do that now.
No
Thanks.
worries. I should also mention to all of you that Wild Seed Project members get this great benefit of joining Heather McCargo, our founder, and I for an hour over Zoom for a Q&A. So if you have a lot of questions that even like a question that's personal to your property or something like that, that's a really good way to bring them up to us, because we do get lots and lots of emails throughout our whole day, and we don't usually have the time to answer every one of them. Especially recently, I've been very busy with a lot of programming. So that's a really good time for us to answer your questions and to hear other people's questions too. Okay, let's see if I can find the next question on here. What is the best type of cherry tree to plant? There's not necessarily a best species of cherry tree, but there's usually kind of a cherry for every situation you might have. So the black cherry that I showed is very versatile, and I'd say that's good for a lot of different situations. It can handle full sun, part shade, and medium to dry soils. That's in our native tree guide as well, the native trees for Northeast landscapes, if you want to check that out. We featured that one. There's also a tree called the pin cherry, which very much grows more in like newly disturbed habitats that have been cut down or where there's been fire. So it comes up as a pioneer plant after a disturbance like that. And another name for it is fire cherry. And that likes full sun, hot, dry areas. So if you have that kind of situation, I'd say the pin cherry would be good for you. The pin cherry is a little bit more of a shorter lived species, and they both actually can be kind of pioneer species, because the black cherry seeds around from birds dropping them in different places, and I do see it pop up a lot of times in suburban neighborhoods and become a tree before anyone realizes it. So if you want to plant it more intentionally in an area that you like, I would do that instead. But there's also the beach plum, which is not a cherry, but it's in the same family and is really important for wildlife value, because it's a host plant to moths and butterflies, and it has lots of flowers for bees, and then it has fruit for a lot of other wildlife too. So the beach plum, I'd say if you have an urban area and you maybe have a small space, it's a really nice small tree or shrub. It can be trained either way. Another question is, are there any wild gardens in Rockport that can be visited? That's a good question. I don't have the answer to that. I don't know Rockport, Massachusetts as well. Shubra, do you know if there are any great gardens that can be visited?
I'm going to ask Lisa. We have Millbrook Meadow. You want to talk about that, Lisa?
Well, we've got Millbrook Meadow, which is totally a composed garden of native plants. But I think that Laura told me at some point that Nick was interested in taking us all over to a wild native garden that he's been planning in Gloucester. So that's a possibility. I'll find out from him about that.
Oh, great. Thank you so much.
But Millbrook Meadow is definitely worth a look. We just planted 2,200 native species in there this spring. And I think it's looking pretty great.
And there is an eel run right in the middle of, right on one side of it. It's just a beautiful spot.
It really is.
I'm gonna have to check that out next time I'm in the Rockport, Massachusetts area. It's a beautiful town.
Yes,
it is.
The other thing that I would recommend is the whole Headlands area. It's not necessarily a garden, but Holly I know has been working on that. Holly, are you there?
Guess not.
I could say something about it.
Laura,
There
yeah,
she
there
is.
Well, it has a lot of native huckleberry and some blueberries, but it also has a lot of invasive bittersweet and other things. It's a mixture.
Well, Laura, since you're speaking, what did Nick tell you about that wild garden he wanted to
I
take us to?
visited it. It's not that large at this point. But I think if you were to contact Nick, he may be able to help you. Also, he's planting another meadow this weekend and for another person. So there might be some possibilities.
Okay,
The
Thank you.
other area that we have that is really beautiful is Halibut Point. Now that's not a garden. It's not a, I don't know, it's not maintained as a garden, but you have a lot of wild species. You have a lot of trees. There's trails going all through it. It's by the ocean. It's gorgeous.
Very nice.
Yeah, we're very fortunate.
Great. Yeah, I'm excited to visit some of those spots. So I'll answer another question now. Does it ever make sense to bring in sand to a site that isn't naturally sandy soil in order to create habitat for ground nesting bees? Or are there potential problems with importing sand? That's a very good question. I think I've had that just a few times, and I don't know. I don't think it's a hard and fast, but I do think it's a good idea to not bring in too many extra materials or inputs when not needed, just because if you can find plants that are suited to the area that you have, then you'll also have the wildlife that goes with them. So like for instance, the spotted bee balm grows in really well in a sand plain environment, like a very well-drained soil and full sun, and happens to be where that great blue wasp also lives, because it lives in sandy soil. So the plant that's associated with those sandy soils is there. And if you don't have sandy soils and you plant a plant that's right for the spot that you put it in, that is adapted to whatever soils that you actually have, then you'll likely have the wildlife that works well in those kinds of situations too. So it's not and for sand, I know the world in general, we're running out of sand. So if we can use sand for very specific projects, I think that would probably just be a better way to go about it. But if you have like a rain garden or another area where you need to improve the drainage, maybe for some other reason, because it needs improved drainage for the function of the site, and sand would make sense for that, then you could think of it that way and import sand for that reason, I'd say. I hope that makes sense. And then another question is, when can you finally do spring cleanup? Maybe I think I kind of addressed this a little bit earlier, but I'd say wait for it to get a little bit warmer through the day, like 60 degrees or warmer, and a little bit before those plant shoots all start coming up, because you don't want to be stepping on them in the garden. Sometimes I've waited until after plant shoots have come up and I've just been very careful. But it does make things a little bit harder. It's harder to rake, and because you're going to damage those plant shoots and things like that. But if you can wait as long as possible before that happens, then that will allow those creatures to finish their overwintering process and emerge as young bees, or as caterpillars, or as moths and things like that. Some moths don't eclose or hatch until May. And so I think that's why I'd say, for a lot of your leaves, if you can leave the interior of the bed alone and just not clean those up at all, and just clean up the edges of the bed, then you're going to make less impact than if you cleaned up the whole bed. So that's a way to kind of meet in the middle with it. All right, I have another question. I just got my native garden from our landscape architect, and we're very excited to be part of the rewilding program. This may not be a question. I haven't read through it all yet. My husband and I are heading out for a sail in 2 weeks, but we'll try to touch base with you as okay. Okay, so that's not as much of a direct question, so I'll address that personally. And then, are there species planted in Millbrook Meadow listed or accessible on the site? Would one of you be able to answer that?
I could answer that. Well, we could easily tell people what the 100 or so species that we planted this year, but in the original restoration, I could again give a list, but I can't tell them where because it's so complicated.
Mhm. Okay. And then what type of pear tree is pest resistant? Well, that's a tough one. I mean, so pears are not native to New England. I think the only pear that I know of that's really a lot more pest resistant and grows really well in New England is the Asian pear. I did work at a nursery that had fruit trees, and I remember the Asian pear is a really great one for colder climates, and it's a little bit more crisp than like a more traditional pear, but it's got like a nice crunch to it, kind of like an apple, but it's really, really tasty. So I remember that being very, very pest resistant from my experience with it. So that's all the questions I see in the chat. Does anybody have any more questions before we end today? Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining. It was a pleasure. And I hope that you found some good resources and a start, even if there's a lot more to learn. It's a good way to get started in thinking about unlearning a lot of the practices of ornamental gardening.
This was great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Yes.